Today we are looking at more and more squad planning. There has been just so much noise, so much discussion in recent weeks about how this is going to be probably the most important summer that United have in a generation. You know, we've got such a threadbare squad. We've got so many issues, and we may have a takeover that is taking place. And so today's video is all about looking at what does this squad need? What do we currently have? And if we want to look at getting promoted, what does a squad need to get promoted out of the Championship? Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to look at sort of areas of players. We're going to go through United's promotion teams from 2018-19, from 2022-23, and we're going to look at, okay, how many players played 90% of games? How many players played 50% of games? What do we need our squad makeup to look like? And how many players do we actually need to be able to compete for promotion? As well as looking at United's two promotion teams, we're also going to look at more recent examples. We're going to look at Leicester and we're going to look at Ipswich from last season and what was their squad makeup looking like when they got promoted. Now, to start us off, what I think is really important is let's all be part of this discussion. Let's all be part of thinking about where we want United to be when we get to the start of the new season. So, if I asked you right now at home, how many new signings do you think United need this summer? Write it down, keep it in your mind, have a think about it. And then through this video, we'll give some examples, we'll talk through squad planning, and we'll see whether or not we change your mind. My gut feel, I think we need 13 new players. That's where I'm starting from. That's how many players I think we will need to be able to be competitive this season. Let's see whether or not that changes. So, I'm going to start us off with the really boring bit. The bit that, you know, we kind of have to talk about because it's relevant, but it's boring. What are the rules? So, in the Championship, you get a 25-man squad. However, this squad does not include any players under the age of 21 unless they've joined your club on loan. Loan players do count in your 25-man list. 8 players within the squad also have to be designated as homegrown. Now, this is a player who, regardless of their nationality, was registered with any club within the English or Welsh FA for 3 years prior to turning 21. So, they're the rules. Standard, relatively straightforward, 25 players and some youth. That's the way that we have to look at it. I think in terms of the homegrown, that pretty much takes care of itself, particularly when you've got Chris Wilder as your manager. So, let's look at the case studies. Let's go through our examples. What can we learn from our recent history? Well, Sheffield United were promoted to the Premier League in 2018 and 19, finishing second under Chris Wilder, securing 89 points. That Sheffield United team had 28 players who made first-team appearances for the club, and this is insane and has blown my mind the more I look at it, and I still don't quite believe it. 9 players played 40 or more games across all competitions. But we didn't go anywhere in the FA Cup or the League Cup. So basically, 9 players, so we only have 11, 9 of them played 40 games in the league. That's insane. So of those players, we had the goalkeeper, obviously. That's the one that you would expect. This player should be playing 46, really. And he did. It was Dean Henderson. He played every game, and he was the only keeper that played for United that season. We then had 4 defenders. We had such a settled defence during this promotion run. We had a very, very settled team. It was basically Basham, Egan, Jack O'Connell, Ender Stevens, and one other. Now, Baldock was the most likely to be the one other, but he only made 27 appearances in the Championship, just over 50% of the available games. We had 2 midfielders who played over 40 games in that season. That was both John Fleck and Ollie Norwood. I think we could have predicted it. I think we all know this team back to front right now, to be honest. It's the team that I have dreams about sometimes. But together, they were almost ever present. Their just consistency all the way through that season meant that we could rotate the third man who played with them. But again, the most likely player to be making that sort of final appearance to fill out that midfield squad was Mark Duffy. He played around 35 games. So looking more like the 75% mark rather than the 50% that we'd seen from somebody like George Baldock, albeit we have to bear in mind that a lot of Duffy's appearances that season did come from the bench as well, as we also had Kieran Dowell making a relatively significant number of appearances. We had 2 strikers who both played over 40. That was 𝗵𝗍𝗶 and 𝗍𝐸, and between them, they built a fantastic partnership. They contributed 39 goals that season just between the two of them. That consistency just meant that they got the instincts when playing together, and that would continue, and we saw how great their partnership could be as we went into the Premier League, albeit that Billy's role was more and more decreased as time began to catch up with him. But what do we learn from that? So as you can see across the pitch, United had consistent partnerships with a system that is so defined, so unique, that relies upon training and learning and practice. We could produce our highest level through having consistency. And as soon as those players started to drop out, as they did when we had injuries a couple of seasons later, you saw that we immediately started to fall apart. But for now, the promotion, the bit that's important, we had a consistent team capable of playing week in, week out, and who were just absolute availability monsters. Now, I cannot believe how often players played during this season. Even the backups were just rarely injured and capable of just going and going and going whenever we called on them. You know, we've talked about Duffy making over 30 appearances. We've talked about Baldock making more than 50% appearances. Leon Clark actually also played in more than 50% of the games that season, and we loaned him out in January. He made 24 appearances before January. That's so much availability. Again, no injuries, nothing limiting his place in the team, just constantly being ready to come on and be there when called upon. So that's 12 players who played 50% or more of the available games, but only 12. That's a really low number because those who did it were just constantly available, never injured, and meant that we could keep going. We then had 9 players who played more than 10 games and less than 50% of games. So when we break that down together, we had 9 who played basically every game. We had 2 who played in the majority of games, 1 who played around 50%, and another 9 who played just under 50%, but more than 10. So we had a core group of players, around 21 players that we relied upon that season, that were usually able to be called upon and able to contribute when we did so. In terms of performance, what did we need from those players? So when I say performance, what I actually mean is goals. Who scored us goals? You know, we've talked about who was available, and being available is fantastic, but you've also got to be quite good. So who scored us goals that season? Well, we had 2 players who scored more than 10 goals, including 𝗵𝗍𝗶, who managed to get a whopping 24. He was well over the 20 goal a season magic mark that everybody likes to look at. But we also had 6 players who managed to get more than 10 goal contributions throughout the season. Now, by goal contributions, I mean goals plus assist. And we had 15 players who contributed to 5 or more goals through the season. That shows a fantastic split of our creativity in terms of our goal scoring. And we had a really nice balance through that squad. We're talking about 21 core players. 15 of them were contributing 5 or more goals. This team was so good. I loved them so much. Like, I've done this, and I was like, oh yeah, this will be great. It'll get me excited for the new season. Hasn't. It's made me want to go back to 2019. I blooming love this team because they are just... I miss you guys. I miss them all. Anyway, let's move on before I start to cry and drink, just thinking back to how good we were before COVID. And let's look at the last promotion season, 2022-2023. United once again were promoted to the Premier League, finishing 2nd in the Championship. This time we did secure a couple of extra points and finished on 91 points. However, what is most notable around this team is that, obviously, due to the FA Cup, we did play a significant number of extra games in all competitions. So that's something we have to bear in mind when we're breaking down the figures for how many games these players played, but also their availability through the season. Now, in this season, we used 33 first-team players. It's an 18% increase on what we'd used in 2019, but again, we also had about the same percentage increase for a number of games played through the season due to that fantastic FA Cup run. Now, we had 10 players who made 40-plus appearances across all competitions, which again shows that we had a really settled team, but also, when we break that down a little bit, when we just look at the Championship, only 4 players made 40 or more appearances in the Championship for United. Now, that's a significant change in terms of the consistency that we'd had in 2018-19 to what we had in 2022-23, and reflects what we can all remember. We had some real injury problems as we were working our way through that season. Now, when we look at the breakdown of those players, again, goalkeeper. It's always going to be a goalkeeper that comes in this. This time it was Wes. He made 40 starts for United. And if he hadn't been sent off twice, he probably would have played more like 44, 45 games. He did miss 1 or 2 through injury, with Adam Davis being the backup who was capable of stepping in. We only had 1 defender, so we went from having that fantastically settled unit in 2018-19, where we had 4 players who played together consistently, regardless of whether nobody got injured. They just played every week. This time, we only had 1 player make over 40 appearances. That was, of course, John Egan, and he was almost ever present in that really key cog in our defence. This defence, actually, despite all that upheaval, despite all the changes, conceded less goals than the really settled defence we had in 2019. So that's just a real testament to the contributions of those players who maybe weren't as consistent, weren't as available as we would want, but even the backups were able to step in and still do a job for United. We had 1 midfielder who appeared in every single game that season. That was Ollie Norwood, albeit he didn't start every game. He came off the bench for 7, I think it was. He played so many minutes, more than 3,500, and that is not something to be sniffed at in terms of just what he contributed to us that season. I know in terms of his productivity, he was fantastic up until the World Cup break. After the World Cup break, his form did dip a little bit, but the fact he was always there, never injured, never sent off, just constantly available for United was huge. And he gave us such a big leadership boost in the centre of the park. Between Wes, Egan, Norwood, we had a core group of players there capable of leading this team and keeping anybody who had to come in or drop out part of the squad. So that was huge to see, and they were huge. The final player, though, is the one that really mattered. The one who played every game in the Championship, starting 43, coming off the bench 3 times. I'm, of course, talking about 𝗜ļiman-Ndiaye. We just couldn't have done it without him. Ultimately, we're going to talk about squad depth, we're going to talk about the players we need, but ultimately what made the difference for this team is that we had the best player in the league, and he was so good this season. 𝗜ļiman-Ndiaye, he was the difference between success and failure, and had he suffered significant injuries, we would have really, really struggled, but he didn't. He was available, and he was bloody brilliant. Just brilliant. So, again, as we break this down into some more of those details, the team's partnerships were a bit more sporadic. We had more players missing games, suffering injuries, but we did still have a little bit of consistency. We didn't have the same level as 2018-19 in defence, but there were 3 players who were regulars. They played more than 75% of the games. That was Baldock, Egan, and Anel. And then the fact that we had the second best defence in the league. We were better in defence in this season than we were in 2018-19. That we did that with only 3 players playing sort of 75% of the games is pretty mad. But it also, again, just reiterates how great the depth we had this season was and how important it is that you don't just have 5 good defenders. You have 7, you have 8. You have enough that they can step in and contribute regardless of whether or not they're going to be your first team regulars. And that's something that we will need to come back to later on. In midfield, only 1 player who played every single game, only 1 player who played more than sort of 90% of the minutes. But we had another couple of players who were capable of contributing. Lots of players who were between that 50% and 75% of available games. Sanderberg played the majority of those alongside Norwood. He played 37 games in the centre of midfield and was really consistently available, which wasn't like him. I remember him as being injured all the time. So to see that he played 37 times in that season shows that he was starting to get a little bit of fitness, get a little bit of consistency, and had built that relationship with Ollie Norwood. We then had the lone boys behind them, Tommy Doyle and James McAtee, both who made fantastic contributions throughout the season, particularly towards the latter stages. They'd been able to grow with the squad and then become first team players by the time that we got to the crunch point when we really needed them. And then we also had John Fleck, who played just over 50% of the games, and you forget how much he contributed to that season because his form had dropped. By the end, he was probably 5th choice. But again, you've got to have those options. When you're struggling through injuries the way that we were this season, you've got to make sure that your backups are capable to come in and step up. And they did. Up front, obviously, we've talked about 𝗜ļiman-Ndiaye. He was the key man. We had partners with him. McBurney and Sharp both appeared in sort of 75%, but both of them were unable to start more than 50% of games. We used 7 strikers throughout this season. That's mad. Like, we were constantly changing who was playing up front. We were constantly changing strikers. And the fact that McBurney, despite only starting half the games, managed to get 15 goals, that's really impressive, actually, because given his availability issues, given how little he played, how little opportunity he'd had to build a partnership with those players around him, he was clearly just capable of coming straight in and contributing immediately. If only he could have played 40 games, he would have been a fantastic, fantastic player for the Blades. So, overall, what does that look like? We had 10 players make over 75%, who appeared in over 75% of the games. We had 15 in total who played more than 50%. And then we had 8 players who made more than 10 games and less than 50% of the games. So that's a bit of a jump from where we were in 2018-19 with 23 reliable players at the core of our squad. This, though, is broken down so differently. It's a much higher number of players who were in that sort of 50% mark rather than those who were kicking up towards the 90%. And ultimately, it meant that we did have some consistency, but you see what that breeds. Those injuries, the issues that we'd had, then fed into what we've seen this season in the Premier League, where we just could not get anybody available and get anybody together and fit. In terms of performance, again, looking at those comparators, mainly looking at the goals, we had 2 players who got more than 10, both of our strikers, Ndiaye and McBurney. Only 1 player got more than 10 assists. The reason I bring it up, because of course it was Iliman Ndiaye. He did the double-double, as it were. He got more than 10 assists and more than 10 goals, which is an insane season, and again reiterates just how good he was. In terms of those goal contributions, we were talking about a significant number of players who were able to contribute under Wilder in that season in 2018-19. Was very different in terms of where we were at in 2022. We're only 10 players being able to register that goals and assist target that we were looking for. So, 2 very different seasons, both looking at a very different sort of picture, but the core remained the same. You had a number of players, particularly through the spine of your team, that had to be available every single week. You then had a group of players who needed to be able to step in to form those partnerships in a significant number of the games. And then you had your backups, people capable of coming in to just play a bit part here and there and being able to make a little bit of a difference. So let's test these case studies just a little bit further before we talk about what we need to do this summer. I'm going to go through these a lot quicker than I did on the last ones. Leicester last season used 27 players in total, and their stats broadly match up to where United were in 2018-19. They had 7 players who made 40 plus appearances. Their centre-back, their back 4, goalkeeper, and 2 players in central midfield. They had 5 players who made over 30 appearances, which included their 2 centre-forwards capable of making a partnership and contributing in their goals. They had 11 players in total who appeared in over 75% of games, and 10 players who made more than 10 appearances, but less than 50% of the games. That's 22 reliable squad members who they relied upon. We're getting a little bit of a picture forming now in terms of how many players you need to have in that core group. It's between 20 and 22. And we then had 3 players for Leicester who scored 10 or more goals, and 5 players who had 10 plus goal contributions. In terms of Ipswich, in their promotion, they used 32 players in total, significantly more than Leicester had used and more in line with what United had done in 2022-23. But again, they had more consistency than we did that year. They had 7 players who made more than 40 appearances in the league. Goalkeeper, 2 defenders, 3 central midfielders, and a striker. They had 6 players making 30 plus appearances and 11 in total that were able to play more than 75% of the games. They are very consistent in terms of that squad breakdown. They used more players in total, but that breakdown of those core players playing every single week is exactly the same as what Leicester had and what United had in 2018-19. Where Ipswich do differ is that they really struggled for consistency in terms of their backup players. They had 11 players who played more than 10 games, but less than 50% of the games. And so their squad core was slightly bigger overall, with 24 reliable squad members that they would call upon week after week. They had 3 players who scored more than 10 goals and 6 players who contributed 10 plus goals in terms of goals plus assists. So that was a lot of stats, a lot of numbers. I've sat here like Rain Man just shouting figures out at you, and hopefully you're able to follow that along with me in terms of what you want from your squad build-up. But what does this now mean for United? And let's look at what we've got to do this summer. By my count, Sheffield United currently have 12 players who we can guarantee will be part of the squad next season, of which only 8 will need to be registered for next season, as the remaining 4 are youth players under 21s who won't need to be counted within our 25-man squad. Within these numbers, I will be clear up front, I am assuming that we will sell 𝗍𝗍𝗂𝗏𝗏, 𝗍𝗍𝗶𝗏𝗏, Anis Slimani, Benny Traore, Anel Ahmedhodzic, and 𝗍𝗍𝗶𝗏𝗀. If Egan and Davis re-sign with the club, I think they're the only players realistically that we're still in contract talks with who will remain with the club. Now, that would move us up to 10 players registered, leaving space for 15 first-team signings if we move to fill our entire 25-man squad. But again, including those youth prospects, that would put us at an overall squad size around 29 to 30 players. Now, let's look at the makeup and how we might want these to start to come together based on our case studies. So consistently, the promoted teams that we have looked at so far have shown that you need 20 to 22 players who are capable of playing more than 10 games, with 13 of those players playing over 50% of the games and 7 players playing in 40 games or more over the season. That core group of 40 plus will need to comprise of your goalkeeper, obviously. You need at least 2 members of a settled defence. You need at least 2 members of a midfield partnership. You then look at the wider structure and you would need at least 2 strikers who are capable of playing in over 75% of the games and who are capable of contributing 10 goals or more. So where does that leave us specifically? We need a goalkeeper. Very clearly, very easy, very obvious. We need a goalkeeper who is going to be capable of playing 46 games without having a clanger and chucking it in his own net week after week after week, as we saw with 𝗍𝗿𝗶𝗲 so far this season. He's been great. So I think we need 2 new goalkeepers. We need the first choice. We also need the backup. I don't personally think Davis is good enough, but if he re-signs, then it's only the one signing that we would be looking for. In terms of our defence, when you look at the amount of games played over recent seasons, we have 2 players who are capable of playing in 40 plus. But this is where the question comes in terms of performance. Robinson and 𝗏𝗏 can definitely do it physically. They have proven that they're available and will be able to play in the number of games we're looking at, but I don't think it's their availability that massively holds them back in terms of looking at a promotion push. If Egan resigns, we also know that he has both the quality and pre-injury was always ready and available to play in 40 plus games whenever he's been through a full season with United. However, given that we've got such little backup behind those 3 players, given we've got question marks over ability, fitness, and even with Egan, his contract situation, I think we need to look at 3 signings at centre-back. So on to the wing-backs. Now, this is a position that historically has seen 1 player, for United at least, who's capable of playing 40-plus games, 2 players who are capable of playing 50% or more, and then 1 player who sits between the 10% and the 50% of games. Now, for that, I think we've already got 2 players capable of doing this. We've got Rhys Norrington-Davies, who will fit that 10 to 50%. And we've got Jayden Bogle, who will play 50% to 75%. So again, we're looking at 2 signings in this place. We need the player who's going to play week in, week out, who's going to prove his fitness and who's going to be consistently available to play for the Blades. And we want another one who's capable of playing the majority of games, but will have his injury issues in terms of where he sits in. It might be that he just alternates between Rhys Norrington-Davies and another left wing back. We know they're good enough, so they could just alternate between them. Similarly, we could try the same at the right side, but I want somebody who's going to be consistently available to play every game. 2 more signings on the board. Now, midfield, and at last, there's not that much work that I think we need to do here. We have a position where we have a partnership that is capable and ready of playing 40-plus games. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 and 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, from what I've seen, from what I've noted from them over the last couple of seasons, albeit that 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 hasn't had that much in terms of senior experience, they look like an excellent midfield pairing, both of whom have not struggled with injuries so far, and therefore should be available to be our 40-plus men. And that is exactly what we want. We need 2 players consistently. They're already at the club. We then now want to look at 1 player who's capable of playing in 75% of games. We want 1 player hitting 50% of games. And we want 1 player playing 10 to 50%. So I think at the club, we've got Tom Davies, who will hit that 10 to 50%. We've got... well, this is a question of quality, isn't it? We've got Andre Brooks. Now, I think Andre Brooks physically would be capable of playing 75% of games, but I think we would probably want the player who's going to be the most regular 3rd choice for our midfield to be a little bit better than he is. I'm just not sure he's quite ready to be making that step up, to be playing consistently in the Championship at this stage. So, for me, we need 2 new signings. And we want to be bringing in the first choice player to put Andre Brooks into the 50% mark. And we want to bring in 1 more backup player, again, capable of playing around 50% of the games, because it means if we do suffer injuries anywhere across the board, we've got that wider squad coverage that we're definitely going to need. So, once more, 2 signings in this bulk, and we are starting to add up to a significant number now. So, having got through the midfield with only the striker position left to look at, I think we need at least 8 new signings. 5 of them who are going to be ready and available and capable of playing 75% or more of games, 1 player who is capable of playing 50% or more, and 1 backup goalkeeper. So now the final stretch is where things get a little bit more complicated, because United so far have got 2 contracted strikers who are with the club. One of them is capable of playing about 50% of games based on what we've seen so far. He did it last season. And one who isn't capable of playing any games, it seems. Just never. Just, do you want a game of football this weekend? Nah, mate. Cool. See you next week. Next week comes. Fancy a game? Nah, mate. Okay, cool. So we've not really got the availability that we need, but we've also not necessarily got the quality that we need. I look at 𝗜ļ𝗱𝗶𝗶𝗲, and yes, he might be able to play 50% of games, but he cannot contribute 10 goals based on what I've seen so far. He has not actually scored a senior league goal for United yet in over 30 appearances. We need somebody who's going to be contributing goals as well as availability. And of course, in Ryan Brewster, he might be able to play 10 games next season, but we cannot rely on that. He's not somebody who we can trust the fitness of, and therefore we obviously need to do some recruitment in this area. And it's really easy, really simple, should be the easiest place to recruit to. We need 2 players, both of whom are capable of scoring more than 10 goals and of playing 35 plus games. Simple, easy, done. Everyone finds it easy to recruit strikers, particularly ones that score goals. They're usually available really, really cheap. So, the final stretch. Where are we at? In order for us to form the basis of our 21-man squad, I make that 11 new signings that we've just covered off as being required based on looking at the availability that we will need in each of our positions. If we look at the overall squad size and start to think about those players who will play in 1 game, 2 games, maybe they'll be asked on for 3 or 4 games. I'm thinking Scott Hogan in 2019 when we brought him in for his loan. I'm thinking Kieran Clark in 2022. You might forget they were there. You might think, oh God, yeah, I forgot that we had him. But when we needed them, they stepped up. And they did contribute just enough that it helped us to get over the line. By my count, you want about 7 of those players who are capable of playing 1, 2, 3 games. They're going to be happy sat on the bench, in the under-21s, in the reserves, but you need them in the squad still. They've still got to be there. By my count, United have got 2 of those players coming at the squad, and they're both right wing backs, 𝗍𝗍 and Sam Curtis. So we need at least 5 more players who are ready and able to contribute when they get called upon. Now, we will look at some youth prospects in this space. We may see Louis Marsh or Owen Hampton being asked to just come in, do a job, sit on the bench, play half an hour at the end of a couple of games. Possibly, some of those players I've said that we're going to sell. Maybe they won't leave. Maybe we'll have Slimani or Benny Traore. Again, not playing regularly, not being asked to contribute loads, but when we need them, we'll just play 2, 3 games. Maybe we'll be regulars on the bench, making 10-minute appearances here and there. But clearly, that's not enough. We need some new players bringing in to fill out our squad space, and they need to be low risk. Let's look at free agents. Let's look at low risk transfers that are going to be cheap, that are going to be easy to bring in. And so I predict that we will make some signings in this space, and I think we will probably need 4 in addition to the current youth prospects and squad players that we've got available. So across the full team, first team core, first team backups, first team reserves, I think Sheffield United will need to make 15 new signings if we genuinely want to be playoff or promotion contenders this season. That's what we need based on the history, based on the stats. They're the players that United need at the club. But that's more than enough from me, because you've listened to me rant on like Rain Man for more than long enough. We want to know what you think. When I asked you back at the start, how many players did United need? Did you have 15 in mind? Do you think, yeah, that's exactly what I said, and now I'm sat here feeling smug that I didn't need to do 30 minutes worth of research? Or do you think I've completely over-egged the pudding? Maybe you're sat there thinking, Jesus Christ, what he's just gone through there, there's no way we need that many players. He's talking absolute rubbish. We need 5 or 6 really good ones, and then we're just going to power through. Let me know in the comments what you think we need to do this summer. Where do you think we should build our squad? Does what I've said make sense? And do you think that we should be targeting those key areas of players who are available and can play the majority of minutes throughout the season? Or is it quality first? Do we go quality, and even if they only play 20 games, as long as they're 20 good games, that's all we need? Thank you so much for watching, and let's look forward to what hopefully will be a very busy and exciting summer for all. There might be 15 signings, there might be a new owner. Who knows the amount of things that are going to be going on with Sheffield United, but we will be here covering it every single step of the way, making sure that you are fully informed as to what is happening with the club. And if that's not enough, there's just that tiny little matter of the Euros, which start very, very soon and which will keep us busy, just in case there's not enough Sheffield United news. Come on, England! Up the Blades.